afternoon, everyone. I am so incredibly excited to be here for a number of reasons. One is around the theme for today's conference, reimagining. So in my job as Global Head of Inclusion, I help leaders figure out how to reimagine the programs, the policies that impact our over 160,000 person company at Google. How do we reimagine, especially in this world of COVID? The second reason that I'm excited is because this is a homecoming for me. I get the opportunity to be back here in Trinidad and share my knowledge base and my experience that I've had and my learnings that I've had with you all here. And so specifically for this year, 2022, it is actually 100 years of my maternal grandmother's birth here in Trinidad. And so I have my entire family here. This is not working. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So 100 years since my maternal grandmother's birth, and it's really given me an opportunity to reflect on the values, the traditions, the cultural wisdom that has been bestowed on me by my family. And in that, there's also a reflection on the elements of culture that I love so much. The food, the music, the parties, or fêtes as we call them. And so I don't think there is anywhere in the world that has a party like the way that we do within the Caribbean. So I'm gonna paint a picture for you all. Some of you may know, some of you may not. But imagine a sea of people. Am I doing, sorry. Could you go to the next slide? Next. So imagine a sea of people at a fete. They've got their island country's flag, whether it's on their head, tied around them somewhere, or just in their hand, waving, waiting for the music to play. And so in addition to just the energy that you have of just seeing a sea of all these different flags, it is such a clear and literal example of unity, that we're all under this Caribbean umbrella, but there's uniqueness in the identities of each one of the islands. And so another element of these parties is this call and response interaction that happens between the audience and then the DJ or the artist, right? They're calling Jamaica, Guyana, Grenada, and there's this anticipation that builds as each island country is waiting for their country to be called so they could act up. And so within that, there's also this underlying anticipation of a certain country, because we know that we save the best for last. And so we're waiting to be called in, right? And so there it goes, Trinidad and Tobago. And the place goes wild, the song drops, everyone is going to the left, to the right, we jumping up. And then I kid you not, 5 minutes later, the whole thing starts all over again. But we don't get tired of that, right? It's the space where we get called in, we feel seen, we feel valued, we feel this sense of belonging. Do you see where I'm going with this example? And so this feeling of inclusion and belonging, unfortunately, isn't always the experience that we have in our work environments, right? We are always having, whether it's unconsciously or consciously, this sense of waiting to be called upon, waiting for our skills, our talents, our superpowers to be recognized and valued so that we can bring our best selves to the workforce, to the work that we're doing. And that doesn't always happen. And when we don't feel that sense of belonging, what happens? You talked about it, disengagement, disconnected. You could leave, so there's high attrition issues that then a company has to deal with. We have performance issues that then we have to spend time away from the core structure of the business to then focus on addressing these performance issues. And so how do we get to the root of really creating a space where people can feel valued, feel like they belong, so that we can zoom to the true potential of the business that we are set out to do? And so, next slide, please. I'll just say that. To reach the true potential of our business, an inclusive culture is a critical component of that, and that requires us to be both business leaders and people leaders together at the same time. The fact is that we all want to build successful businesses, however we define that. And so next slide. Today's agenda and things that I want us to really focus on, no matter how we define success, is merging the mindset of business and people skills, developing the roots of inclusive culture, and then reflecting and acting on inclusive leadership. Next slide. So as Narad spoke about in my bio, I have a 20-year career as an engineer, a business leader, and a DEI practitioner. And so for more than half of that career, I had a business-centered mindset. I didn't have any education or formal training or discussions around diversity, equity, or inclusion, or around a people-centered mindset. Those words didn't exist. How many of you feel that way about the career path that you've had in your life, right? Business-centered, it's focused on results and outcomes. However, with this unique career path that I've had, it's allowed me to really shape my leadership mindset and have a vision that provides the connective tissue between being business-centered but also people-centered in service of the job that we're trying to do. Next slide. And so I love this quote by Simon Sinek, which says, "Leadership is not about being in charge, but about the people in your charge." And so what does that mean? That we have to be focused on the people that are working together towards the goals that we have. We have the ability as leaders, each one of us in this room, to not only focus on outcomes and results, but also to focus on the commitment and motivation factors that are needed to allow people to do their best work. Next slide. And so with this people-centered mindset, it allows us to really do three things when it comes to people, right? So this is super practical tips on what you can do. One is focus. Focus on building relationships with colleagues. It's not enough for us, especially in this space after COVID, to be so transactional. We spent the last 2.5 years in each other's homes, seeing kids running around, dogs running around, pets, all sorts of things happening in the background. And so this space between work and our personal life has blurred. And so what that means is that we cannot say, oh, well, we're back to work, and now let's just ignore the conversations, the connectedness that we've had over the last 2 years. How do we develop that? How do we keep that going? The second is around coaching. So how to coach employees to their full potential. Again, we cannot focus on being transactional. We need to understand the people that we are working with so that we can place them in the places where they will be most successful, that we can provide the resources and support that they will need to be most successful. And you can't do that unless you are in that coaching mindset, reflecting and sharing the things that you have done to get where you are, and then being able to provide the resources for them to be able to do the same. And last is align, so aligning teammates towards a common goal. A lot of us have experienced competition, the favorite one, the one that gets all the projects, the one that gets to be in the spotlight, most visible. But that can cause tension when in collaboration, in the need for collaboration, we need teammates to be aligned and working towards the same goal versus working towards individual goals. And I think for me, what I've realized is that business opportunities, business challenges, they are done by people and with people. And so if we don't take on these steps, if we don't create this environment, business still gets done, right? I could attest, we've all been and have been in toxic environments, and those companies are still likely doing very well financially. We can name them all. However, when we talk about culture and the impact that we want to change, what could it look like if we're doing this well under these circumstances? What is that true potential? What is that true growth and scale and impact that we can have if we decide to put more investment in this space and the people that are actually doing the work? And so, this notion of culture, it's not vague. It's not this vague aura that suspends above us as, either a rain cloud or a rainbow. But it's something that takes real intentional work that, again, is done by people. Next slide. And so this reminds me of this quote that we often hear, that people don't leave organizations, they leave managers. And so, as I mentioned, I started off in engineering, but because of a manager, I actually left engineering altogether. And so in my first role, I had an older white male manager that loved to share stories about things he did, about cultural references before I was born. That was his way to pass the time, was to talk about what a big age difference we had and all these things that happened before I was born. It was such an incredibly isolating and just terrible experience that I left engineering completely because of that experience. And so with that, that's part of why I'm in this role that I do, focusing on women of color, focusing on women who are also one of the only or one of a few within their work environments. Because what the majority, what men don't realize, is how the different ways that they show up can impact how we show up. And as women, we may not always express that outwardly, but we are dealing with that inside, and we make the decision either to stay and fight, to move around within the company, or to just find greener pastures somewhere else. And so, according to the International Labor Organization, work is the very core of life for most people. It provides financial security, personal identity, and connection to having an impact on our community. We spend most of our time, most of our life in the workspace. And so when it's this important from both a time resource and an energy resource, it's really important that we focus on this. And knowing how important it is and how much time we spend there, we still read, we still see statistics that show what the degradation of mental and physical health is on employees every single day. And so we then know when your physical health is impacted, when your mental health is impacted, that can cause dire consequences. And as all of you as safety leaders in this room, you know the impact if people aren't mentally at the top of their game, if they aren't physically at the top of their game. What impact does that have on the plant floor, in the different spaces where safety is of the utmost urgency? And so we're all attuned to the impact that can have, but we have to be committed to do the work to change the environments that can allow for us to thrive. Next slide. And so while I shared my experience about managers, management matters, but leadership and culture matter more. And here's what that means. People leave bad managers, we know, but it's not the #1 reason that people leave companies. When people are at a good company, good managers are it's a bonus. when people are at bad companies, toxic environment companies, whether that manager is good or not doesn't impact their decision to leave. Why is that? Well, the structure is flawed. The manager can only protect you so much. They can only get you to the next level so much when the systems are not there to either develop you or progress your career. And so if the environment isn't healthy, we can't have the success and thrive. We can't reach the true potential for our business. We can't reach the levels of success, however we define them. And so how do we create that environment? Next slide. In 2016 Google had a multi-year research study around what makes a perfect team. And it was named Project Aristotle after a quote that he shared around the sum of parts is better than the individual. And so the belief was that employees can do more when they're working together than alone. And so of the 5 benefits that they found, or 5 research pieces that they found around what makes a perfect team, psychological safety was number 1. Now, psychological safety has come up how many times in this conference? I've been counting. It was about 8 or 9 times that folks throughout the day have mentioned the word psychological safety. And Google's research continues to back that up. But, this notion of psychological safety is, that there's a shared belief that the team is safe in making an interpersonal risk. They're able to share an idea. They're able to push back on things without the risk of being penalized for that. And so now some people hear the term psychological safety and make the assumption that it's just like this soft skill that, is not really important, that it means that there's no accountability, or perhaps that, you're coddling your employees and that you actually don't get the high performance. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Next slide. And so 4 components of psychological safety, and again, because you keep hearing it so many times today, that means it's important. And I think each of the folks that have shared it so far have given different aspects of psychological safety that you can employ. So the first one is listen more, talk less. And so that means leaning in to listen, although as leaders, we already have it figured out. We know the problem, the solution, who should work on it, but we need to quiet our mind in those instances and listen to what our employees have to say and actually what they aren't saying. Why aren't they pushing back on some of the things that are being brought up? Why aren't they offering ideas? If you're just hearing yes, 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 that doesn't mean that you're perfect and you got it all figured out. It means that the team and the environment that you have around you do not feel safe enough to have a positive dialogue around what needs to be done for that project to reach that goal. The second is to praise generously. Think of it, when we interact with our children, right? Biological or nieces and nephews or kids of friends. We love to repeat back to them the good thing that they did and praise them and make them feel good because we know that it's instilling in them to repeat that behavior. That does not change once we become an adult, right? We still want that praise. We still want the specificity to hear what we are doing well so that we can continue that, so that we can have clarity, so that we can have a path forward. And so without that praise, without that specificity around what we're doing well, we don't know how to operate, how to move forward. We're moving around essentially in the dark. The third is to reframe negative feedback. And so the key part here is to share criticism, but share it wisely. One, you need to create the space. In front of people, not the thing to do. Maybe it's the wrong time. So say, hey, I'd love to get your feedback, or I'd love to offer some feedback with you on this. Is now a good time? Can we meet later? So that you are entering into a conversation with both folks ready to, or prepared to have a respectful, but also a dialogue that they can receive. The third is around, having to figure out how you're going to frame that by sharing the experiences that you have. The point isn't to just tell someone, hey, you did that wrong, but say, hey, I actually made that mistake before. Here's how it worked out for me. Here's what I did to course correct. And so it gives that reflection to your employees, to whoever you're giving that feedback to. So it feels like less of you talking down to them, but a conversation that's being had between two peers, between two equals, between two humans. We forget that. And the fourth is pay attention. Remember the humanity of each of us. We all walk into the office or walk onto the Zoom call with things with us on our shoulders, personal, professional, societal. There isn't a day that goes by there isn't some little thing or some really big thing that just weighs on our soul and sits in our spirit or on our heart, and that could impact how we show up. And so it's important to do check-ins with your folks so that you can understand, hey, I know this may be a tough time. Are you okay? Are you good? I see that you're acting a bit different. Anything that you want to talk about, you have to pay attention to the little details. And so with these four aspects of psychological safety, the goal isn't to do all of these things at one time, to feel overwhelmed by it. It's micro steps, it's intentionality, it's self-awareness around what we can do differently in each interaction that will just shift the perspective, shift the relationship in a positive way. Next slide. And so, also with talking about the space of psychological safety, a lot of folks feel that it is, for those people over there, somewhere back there. But, psychological safety has been talked about at thousands of companies in multitudes of different industries. And so it is something that you can actually action on. And so what I want to focus on next is around inclusive leadership. Right? What are the ways that we can reflect and action and then test and iterate, right, as the hypothesis theory on different parts? And so there are three layers to the inclusive leadership that I want us to kind of go deep into. One is around yourself. And so reflecting on how are you modeling the behavior, such as authenticity, vulnerability, your humanity. So think about just a few minutes earlier in my talk where, I admitted that I did not know about diversity, equity, and inclusion for most of my career. But then I'm on the journey to figuring it out. I've leaned into it so much that I've now made it part of my career. But modeling that vulnerability lets the people around you, the people that you're talking to, know that, okay, it's okay to admit what you don't know. It's okay to then have a dialogue about what you're doing, where you are on your journey, and what you're doing to proceed forward. The second is around people managers. Next slide. How are you empowering your people managers to bring empathy and psychological safe spaces in the workplace? Now, I have to take a minute for this to be a PSA in support of our middle managers. Again, referencing COVID, we went through a time where managers just, relationships of different, on the spectrum in terms of relationship building. But now, managers are inundated with not only meeting business goals, but dealing with post-COVID racial things that are happening, societal, government, all of these pieces, and now employees are looking to managers to solve, to understand, to deal with all of these issues that are happening, again, because we now have really blurred the line between our personal and professional life. And so there's an opportunity here for us as leaders who have the influence, who have the decision-making ability to create space to have these discussions with our people, but also to be able to provide resources to them. Hey, if your team comes to you with this issue, these are the resources that we have. How can we prepare and provide the tools for our middle managers to deal with the burden of what they are having to deal with their team, but then also with their own personal life, and then also with the continuing and growing needs of the company. And so there's this study that said that since COVID, over 43% of middle managers are on the brink of burnout. And that was more than double what it was for individual contributors and more than double what it was for senior leaders. And so we see that you know, sandwich, for lack of a better word, of where we need to focus on building up the competencies of middle managers to really match and support what the teams, what our employees are looking for. Next slide. Next slide. The last is the systems, right? So how do you ensure your programs, policies, and processes are equitable and inclusive? And this is my favorite part, right? The 3 Ps. Those 3 Ps are so critical. It's so crystal clear that after this, when you go back to work tomorrow or the next day, that you can sit down and take a look. What are your programs that you have? Who's being centered in those programs? Who is benefiting from those policies, but also who's being excluded from them? Processes included, whether it's formal or informal. So think of now that we're in this Zoom world where we're consistently on VC, that, you know, hey, could you, throw up the slide and talk us through it? We're not thinking about the diversity of our team members that may have vision issues, and so looking at the screen on their laptop isn't really helpful. We're not thinking about our neurodivergent employees who need more time to think through and process what they're about to be seen. And so how do we adjust the processes of engagement that we have to prepare people without calling them out? You don't even have to ask or take a poll as to who needs this, but doing these things proactively to allow for folks to be able to process, think through, see clearly what is being presented to them. Those are the little things. Those are the calling in of the island countries to say, I see you, you're valued. And so when you take the time to review those programs and policies, it really allows for that cultural shift. Another example, tuition reimbursement is a popular perk for lots of major companies. Sounds good, I get my money back, but what if I don't have the money to give in the first place? Then this perk, which sounds really great on the surface, is actually something that a lot of marginalized communities cannot take advantage of because they don't have the money to put forward first. So again, I implore you, think through what are those programs, what are those policies, what are those processes that you can really dive into, think through, and make tiny shifts to change so that you're calling in the folks that you work with, work for. Next slide. And so before we go, I want you to remember these lessons. When you think differently and implement some of these strategies, you and your people can work towards an inclusive work culture. The benefits are increased productivity, better safety, and just a higher return rate, whether that's financially or with people staying and not having a high turnover. So merging the mindset and the strengths of your business and people skills We are all strong, business-minded folks here. We invest in ourselves when it comes to the business that we're in. This is evident by the people in the room, by the people in the hall, and the work that AmCham is doing through this conference. That same level of investment needs to happen of how do I show up for myself, for my company, for my team members, for the organization, for the stakeholders that we have. The second is to develop the roots of inclusive culture through psychological safety. I know that after this, in the next meeting that you all have, you're going to be looking for those signals of psychological safety. Who's over speaking, who's not speaking, who's over talking, and being able to be aware of what's happening will then allow you to then do those micro shifts to make those changes. And then finally, reflect and action on the 3 layers of inclusive leadership. It is not only your job, but it's also for you to reflect on and action on, for your team to reflect on and action on, and for the shift that we need to make in our systems in order to bring us to our true business potential. And with that, I thank you for your time.